Welcome back. This is our lecture 5, and we are going to continue with the general topic of how human beings come to represent and understand reality. In these lectures, we are going to look at a very special kind of cognitive problem humans face, the problem of perceiving causality. How do we attribute intentions to other people, and how do we make causal inferences about what motivates people's behaviors? This is essentially a research area that seeks answers to the questions, why do people act the way they do? And you can extend this to ourselves, why do we ourselves feel, think, and act the way we do? How do we explain the behavior of other people? And also, how do we make sense of our own behavior? The most fundamental point we can make about human attribution is that humans, in a sense, are designed by evolution to see causal relationships everywhere. If you think about it, it's quite easy to understand that in our ancestral evolutionary environment, understanding the surrounding situation and making inferences and predictions about what is likely to happen was a very important symbolic challenge for ancient humans. And so we developed a way of thinking where we are looking for and typically finding causal connections between observed events. In other words, we represent the world in a causal schema. Causality is our fallback way of understanding what we observe. This was very nicely illustrated in an early study by Heider and Simmel. You might want to click at the link and watch that very short cartoon. What Heider and Simmel did, they projected a very small, very primitive cartoon on a screen where three different geometric shapes, a triangle, a square, were moving around in space in various ways. If you look at the film, you will see that essentially it's fairly random movement. What Heider and Simmel found, though, that when they questioned people after viewing this video to describe what happened, invariably they interpreted this inanimate sequence of events, this movement of geometric figures, as if they were humans with causal intentions. In other words, you would hear descriptions like the triangle was chasing the square was trying to hide, and so on. In other words, the fundamental method, the fundamental scheme for humans to understand reality is to make a causal story, to deal with observations as if they revealed some kind of an underlying causal structure. And furthermore, our tendency is to see outside events as if they were anthropomorphic, as if they're humans, and as if they had internal causal forces. Now, the first person who was interested in attribution theory was a German psychologist called Fritz Heider, who actually never did an experiment himself. He wrote a book about the nature of interpersonal behavior. And he proposed the idea that human beings, in order to make sense of their everyday life, essentially behave as if they were naive scientists. And what Heider meant by naive scientists is that we observe the events around us and we test hypotheses about why they occur. And based on the hypothesis and based on the feedback, we make some conclusion about the causal location of the observed behavior. Heider argued that there are basically two kinds of causal factors that humans look for. Internal causation, when an action is attributed to the internal causes of the actor, and external causation, when we attribute behavior to an external cause, the situation or some other external force. Later in attribution theory, some people suggested a third dimension, controllability. Now, if we combine internality and externality, and we add an additional causal dimension, which is whether the cause is stable or unstable, then we can create a classification system for the possible causes of behavior by combining internality, externality, and stability and lack of stability. This was the model that was put forward by Weiner. So Weiner argued that essentially there are four kinds of causal categories that humans look for. When a cause is attributed internally and it is unstable, in other words, it's going to change, then we can attribute the outcome to effort. You made an effort on this occasion. When the causation is internal and stable, then it is a question of ability. You have a long-term trait, a permanent characteristic that can explain your behavior. When the cause is external and unstable, then we can attribute it to luck. It's not stable, it's changeable, and it's external. When the causation is external and stable, then your behavior can be explained by the ease or difficulty of a particular task. So think about an example. Let's say you're trying to explain your performance in the exam of this course. And these are your options. If you make an internal unstable attribution, you might say it's because I made an effort or because I didn't study at all, lack of effort. If you make an internal stable attribution, you might say it's got to do with your ability or lack of ability. External unstable would be luck. You really don't know why you did well or badly. And external stable is the ease or the difficulty of the exam. These are the options you have to explain the outcome of your exam performance. Now, attribution theories progressed to develop more and more sophisticated models trying to understand how humans make sense of causality. Jones and Davis in 1965 put forward the discounting principle. The discounting principle says that internal causality can only be inferred when an observed behavior is A, cannot be explained externally. For example, it's not socially desirable or expected. And secondly, has unique non-common effects. When those two conditions prevail, you are more likely to infer internal rather than external causation. An even more sophisticated model was put forward by Harold Kelly, a social psychologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, who developed a three-dimensional so-called covariation model to try to explain how causal attributions are made. Kelly argued that there are three dimensions that people use to infer the appropriate source of causality. Consistency is observing whether an observed person behaves in this way reliably across in the same situation in many contexts or not. Unless the observed behavior is consistent, it's very difficult to make any causal inference at all. The second dimension is consensus, comparing the target's behavior with the behavior of others. What do other people do in that same situation? And finally, distinctiveness is observing whether the observed person behaves that way in other situations as well. In other words, if the behavior is distinctive for that individual. So these are the three dimensions that Kelly proposed. Consensus is what do other people do. Distinctiveness, whether the behavior is generalized across other situations. And consistency, whether the behavior of the actor in that situation is the same across circumstances. Another way to represent this model is like a three-dimensional representation of causality. So, for example, Seymour makes a pass at Lolita. This is the behavior you're trying to explain. And these are the three dimensions you seek observations on. Consistency, how this behavior varies across settings and time. So does Seymour behave that way in a classroom, at a party, at work, at a bar, or not? Consensus is how it varies across people. Seymour made a pass at Lolita, but how about Tom, Dick, and Harry? Did they also make a pass at Lolita? And distinctiveness is whether Seymour's behavior is distinctive to Lolita, or he makes a pass at Susie, Marcy, and Sister Mary Teresa as well. Now, if you put together these three different sorts of information, which according to Kelly serve the basis of reliable causal inferences, then you can come up with an internal or an external attribution. Here is another example of this kind of causal attribution task. Why is the server flirting with a customer? The server flirts with the customer, and you can see that many other servers also flirt with the customer. That means high consensus. The server flirts with this customer at other situations and other times as well, high consistency. And the server does not flirt with any other customers, which means distinctiveness is high. In this situation, the server's behavior is attributed to external causation, that is the customer. Presumably the customer is highly attractive. In the other combination, you observe the same behavior, but the covariation is different. No other server flirts with this customer. Consensus is low. The server flirts with the customer at other situations as well, which means consistency is high. And the server also flirts with other customers. Distinctiveness is low. In this context, you can attribute the behavior to internal causes. This server likes to flirt. She is a flirting kind of person. There is internal causation and disposition. This is yet another way of illustrating that three-dimensional covariation model. You ask yourself the question, does the person behave this way in other situations? Do other people behave the same way in similar situations? And does the person behave this way consistently? And this will give you different attributional outcomes. Now, the Hyder model, as well as the Jones-Davis model, and the Kelly model share a common assumption. They assume that inferring causality is very similar to a kind of scientific process. It's almost like an experiment. We observe what's happening in the outside world, and we seek correlations or patterns that allow us to make causal attributions of internality or externality. So that's Hyder's view, the model of the naive scientist. However, it turns out that many attributions are nowhere near as rational, clear-cut, and systematic as Hyder, Jones, and Davis, and Kelly assumed. Quite early in attribution research, people have discovered that there is a large number of possible distortions or biases in the attributional process. By and large, we can divide these biases as coming from two different sources. They can be cognitive. Cognitive biases occur when a person's simply not able to properly attend to and process the available information. We have seen in the previous lectures that human information processing capacity is limited, constrained, and also we don't always pay the necessary attention to our environment. When we don't process properly, we are talking about a cognitive bias in attribution. The other source of biases is motivational. It turns out that the kind of causal attributions we make are very important to us. We are not neutral in terms of determining why things occur. we have a vested personal interest in preferring certain explanations to others. For example, when you try to explain why you did well or badly at an exam and why your friend did well or badly at an exam, you're not a dispassionate scientific observer. You have a vested interest in trying to convince yourself that you were innocent of the bad mark you got by maybe claiming external attribution, the exam was difficult. And when you compare yourself with your friend, again, you are not dispassionate. You have a motivation to explain his or her behavior in such a way that it is comfortable for you. So now we are going to walk through, discuss a number of the attributional biases that researchers have identified. Perhaps the first and most universal one, which in a sense is not even a bias, but it could be regarded as a bias, is the claim by Heider and Simmel that human beings are biased to attribute. The very tendency of seeking causal explanations is in a way a bias. The outside world and the causality we observe in the outside world is essentially a construction in our minds. Causality is in the mind of the beholder. So the Heider and Simmel film, where the geometric figures were moving around, is a good example of how we report on observed inanimate events as if they were carried out by people with causal power and motivation. Another way to describe it is the tendency to anthropomorphism, to see the world as inhabited by self-directed causal entities. Now let's move on to the second very important attributional bias, and this is called the fundamental attribution error, or sometimes this is the correspondence bias. It refers to the fact that when we observe behavior, we have a very strong tendency to overestimate the importance of internal causes, internal to the person, and we tend to underestimate or ignore likely external causes. It's called the correspondence bias because we tend to assume that the actor and the observed behavior correspond to each other. The behavior corresponds to intentions. It is intended. Now, this is a very common bias. Let me give you one example. Let's say you drive your car and the policeman stops you and gives you a ticket. In a situation like that, most of us blame the policeman. We have a tendency to identify causality in the observed person. And we ignore the fact that policemen are doing their job. They have a very strong external constraint on their behavior. This is what they have to do. Their personal freedom in doing it or not doing is very limited. That's what their jobs prescribe. There are many other situations where we make such fundamental attribution errors. For example, most people tend to assume that their bosses are driven by internal causation. If your boss is nice to you, you think that's because he's a nice person. If your boss is nasty to you, you assume that maybe she's nasty or has some other internal personal problems. And yet, most of the time, bosses just are doing their jobs. The demand of managing a particular situation is much more important to them often than their personal inclinations one way or another. Now, why would human beings so inclined to make this incorrect attribution of internal causality? One possible cause is cognitive. We tend to focus on the actor. The person we observe is the focus of attention. We pay attention. And that means that we pay less attention to the situation than to the actor. And that tends to result in the causal attribution internally. The actor dominates the field. The other prediction, and that's an interesting one, that the belief in personal agency, the ideology, especially of Western individualistic societies, is that Human beings are individuals, should be treated as individuals, and therefore they are free agents. Believing in agency is a very important cultural value that influences all of us. One of the earliest demonstrations of the fundamental attribution error was reported in an experiment by Jones and Davis. In this experiment, participants were asked to make judgments about the attitudes of the writer of a speech which was advocating either a pro-Castro, an unpopular view, or an anti-Castro, a popular view. In addition, there was another manipulation. Half the judges were told that the speech was written under coercion. In other words, the writer was told which point to argue. In the other condition, the writers were allowed to make their own choices about the topic. Results showed a significant fundamental attribution or correspondence bias because judges made a significantly different judgment about the attitudes of the writer even when the topic was assigned or coerced. This indicates a fundamental attribution error because if they took into account the external coercion, the fact that the writers had no choice in which point to argue, then the judgments should be exactly the same in the assigned condition, independent of the actual content of the essay. So the size of the fundamental attribution error in the figure in the right-hand columns is the difference between the purple and the yellow bars, which indicate the difference in the perceived attitudes of the writers of coerced essays across the two conditions. Just as is the case with many other cognitive and attributional biases, the incidence of the fundamental attribution error also partly depends on the kind of information processing strategy judges adopt. When they think carefully and attentively, the fundamental attribution error is less likely to be committed than in conditions when people use shortcuts, simple heuristic thinking. This was supported by an experiment that we have carried out, Forgas, Bauer and Moylan, 1990. In this study, we used a similar procedure to the original Jones and Davis experiment. We asked participants to rate the attitudes of a writer of an essay that was advocating either a popular position against nuclear testing or an unpopular position for nuclear testing. We manipulated the information processing strategy of the judges by inducing them into a positive or a negative mood. We do know that positive mood tends to promote a more superficial, simplified, heuristic processing style, and negative mood tends to promote a more careful and attentive processing style. As you can see in the figure on this slide, positive mood increased and negative mood decreased the likelihood of the fundamental attribution error. In other words, people in a positive mood were much more influenced of the content of the essay, even if it was coerced, than were people in the control condition. And interestingly, in the sad mood condition, the fundamental attribution completely disappeared. In other words, when people adopt a more cautious, thorough, slow information processing style, they are much less likely to commit the fundamental attribution error. Here is another example of how attributors tend to underestimate the power of situational constraints. This is the so-called Quizmaster study by Ross, Amabile, and Steinmetz. In that situation, the subjects, the participants, observed a quiz show where a quiz leader, a quizmaster, questioned a contestant. And the participants, the questioner, the contestant, and the external observers were all asked to indicate who was the more knowledgeable, the questioner or the contestant. They had to rate the knowledge of the contestant who had to answer questions and the quizmaster who asked the questions. Now, if humans were rational, you would immediately recognize that asking the questions is much easier than answering them. So we really don't know very much about the knowledge of the quizmaster because the quizmaster faces a much easier situation than a contestant who has to answer the questions. Now, what the figures show that the quizmaster, the questioner, was aware of it and didn't rate the knowledge of himself and the questioner as very different. That's the left side of the graph. The contestant and external observers were both biased in terms of the fundamental attribution error. They both perceived the quizmaster, the questioner, as significantly more knowledgeable than the contestant. And that indicates that they ignored the situational differences facing them. The quizmaster had an easy task, the contestant had a much more difficult task. Similar attributional biases might account for the fact that, for example, university lecturers or professors might be perceived as smarter than they are because it is, after all, they who determine what they want to talk about. They are the ones who set the exam. So in a way, they have an easier task to show their knowledge than students who have to show their knowledge relative to demands set by outside forces. So that might explain why people often in public life, politicians, people on television, authors, writers, seem to be smarter than they really are because the situation favors them. And when we commit the fundamental attribution error, we infer greater causality inside the actor than would otherwise be justified. Now, I mentioned earlier that the tendency to make dispositional attributions, the fundamental attribution error, correspondent inferences, may be partly a reflection of the cultural values of Western individualistic societies. And here is a neat study by Miller, 1984, comparing attributions in the United States and India, and also looking at age differences between children and adults. And basically what they found was that children do not differ very much in the two cultures in the way they make attributions. But when you look at adults, the differences are quite striking. Indian participants tend to make far fewer internal personal attributions and tend to make far more situational external attributions. The red line is the way Indian participants use causality, not personal but external. And of course, India is a much more communal society than the United States, and so perhaps people in adulthood are conditioned to think of themselves and other people as essentially too subject to the communal norms of the culture in which they live. Americans, on the other hand, live in a highly individualistic society. What we learn in Western liberal democracies is that individuals are free and make choices and can realize themselves. And one consequence of this way of thinking is that we are more likely to infer internal causation in observed behavior. It's particularly interesting that the differences between the Indian and the US populations are not that great at age 8 or 11. It's later, at age 15 and adulthood, that the attributional strategies show a significant divergence. The point is that the way we think about the causation of behavior is partly determined by the culture and the civilization in which we live. Here is another interesting illustration of how different cultures direct us to think differently and make differential attributions. This is the result of a study by Masuda and Nisbet, 2001, who compared American and Japanese students in terms of how they remember and describe an image that you see below. Both of the groups, of course, did describe the salient objects, the fish in this image. The difference was that Japanese students also tended to talk and remember much more about the background in this image, the frog, the plants, as well as the fish. In other words, it's as if Americans focus on the key salient features and ignore the background and the environment. The Japanese seem to pay more equal attention to all the minor details of the picture as well. This seems to be consistent with the idea that Western cultures focus us on the acting individual in the focus of attention, and more communal cultures distribute attention more evenly to all details of the incoming information. Now, another common attributional error is what's called the actor-observer effect. This refers to the tendency that when it comes to explaining our own behavior, we tend to give external explanations. We acted the way we did because that's what the situation required. When it comes to explaining the behavior of other people, we often give more internal attributions. We see the causation as residing inside the other person. There is lots of studies that show that there is this fundamental divergence in the way people explain their own behavior and the behavior of other people. We focus on the environment. If you like, we look from the inside out and blame external causes. And when we look at other people, we focus on the actor. It turns out in many studies that, for example, if you ask people a simple question, to what extent do particular personality traits correctly describe you or correctly describe another person, most of us tend to think that the traits are not terribly applicable to us. We see ourselves as very changeable and our behavior is caused by outside forces. Other people, on the other hand, are more likely to be explained in terms of consistent traits. We see them and see their behavior as driven by internal causes. Now, there are many examples of that. Let's say you are late to an appointment. You never say, I'm lazy, I'm inattentive, I got up too late. You never make an internal attribution. You always say, the bus came too late, there was a lot of traffic, or somebody held me up. Our explanations are almost always environmental, external, and not internal. On the other hand, when somebody else is late for an appointment, we tend to give an internal attribution. They are careless, they are impolite, and they haven't paid enough attention. Similarly, when a car cuts in front of you, the typical explanation is you blame that person, you blame that driver, you make an internal attribution. If you do it to another person, you blame it on the circumstance. I didn't have enough space, the other person was going too slowly, whatever. We find a causal attribution in which we are not responsible, but the situation is. It turns out that this basic biasing tendency to see causality in the environment for ourselves and in the person for other people can be reduced in situations when people are being made aware of themselves. For example, some experiments, you simply place a mirror in front of the person while they're making attribution judgments, and what happens is that their tendency to perform this actor-observer bias reduces. When they see themselves in front of them in a mirror as an object, they are less likely to focus on the environment and more likely to find explanations inside. The figure shows the results of another study making the same point. If you ask yourself why you happen to like your girlfriend and why your friend likes his girlfriend, the answer showed that for ourselves, we find the explanation outside. Our girlfriend is very desirable, very wonderful. We see the external causation. For the other person, you are more likely to give an internal attribution. Maybe he's insecure, or maybe this is the best he could do. We tend to find some explanation which locates causation inside the other person. Now, let's move on to another fascinating example of attributional biases, and this is the study of salience effects. That experiment was done by Taylor and Fisk, and it's one of the very elegant and interesting experimental manipulations. The experiment was set up as you see on the slide. Two people, actor A and actor B, were having a conversation with each other, and there were 6 people sitting around them who observed the conversation. It's very simple. 2 people have a conversation, 6 people observe. The manipulation was that 2 of the observers were sitting behind actor A, so they had a really good view of actor B, but they didn't really see actor A. 2 of the other observers were facing actor A and sitting behind actor B, so they had a good view of actor A, but not of actor B. And 2 observers sitting right in the middle had an equally good visual perception of both actors. Now the question is, how does this visual arrangement impact on the causal attributions made by the observers? And here are the fascinating results. Remember, all 6 observers witnessed exactly the same interaction. And yet, what happens? The 2 observers who were facing actor A gave a much greater causal attribution to actor A for the conversation. They could see more causality in the behavior of actor A. The 2 observers sitting in the middle gave a more or less equal attribution to both actors. And the 2 observers who were facing actor B and saw actor B much better tended to see actor B as a much more important causal agent in the observed encounter. Now, this kind of salience effects occur very often in everyday life, and many studies showed that whatever happens to be highly visible, highly in the focus of attention, tends to be given greater causal status. This is actually a good example of a cognitive bias, because we see different information and pay attention to different information, our attributional strategies follow. Now let's move on to another class of attributional biases, which are driven not so much by cognitive limitations, but by motivational factors. One of the interesting motivated attribution biases is what's called the just word bias, described by the social psychologist Lerner. Lerner observed that when people are given information about tragic, negative, uncontrollable events happening to other people, undeserved and unpredictable suffering, and asked to give an explanation for why this is happening, a very strange thing happens. People tend to try to find a way of blaming the victim. If your friend tells you that he came home late at night from the pub and cut through the dark park and he was attacked, then there is a kind of a tendency when you hear that story to immediately say, well, why was he in the pub? Why was he coming home late at night? Why did he cut across the dark park? We try to find a handle where we can make some internal attribution, even though the event is completely random and unpredictable and undeserved. Lerner argues that this tendency of blaming the victim is driven by a deep-seated need in humans to try to see the world as a just and reasonable place. When we are confronted with information that terrible, undeserved and unpredictable misfortune happens to other people, in a way it's very threatening, because it could happen to us. One way of reducing that unpleasant psychological state is by looking for internal causation in the victim. Because if we can find a way to argue that the victim was responsible, the implication is that we ourselves, by behaving differently, can avoid the same misfortune. Self-serving attributions generally occur when we are motivated by a desire to see ourselves positively and to defend our positive self-esteem. For example, it's very common in inferences to attribute success to ourselves, in other words, take credit when something goes well, and to blame failures when we don't do well to outside external causes. This pattern was nicely illustrated in a study by Baumeister, Stilwell, and Wotman, who asked participants to give explanations for bad behavior, exactly the same bad behavior, when it was committed by themselves or when it was committed by another person and they were the victims. What Baumeister and his colleagues found that when people are themselves responsible for bad behavior, they tend to excuse themselves by emphasizing external situational factors, and they try to bagatelize, minimize the seriousness of their behavior. When they are victims, on the other hand, when they are themselves suffered the same bad behavior by other people, they tend to explain it in terms of finding causation inside the actor, the character and the dispositions of the person who upset them. A particularly interesting motivated misattribution of behavior occurs when men and women seem to interpret differently similar behaviors when performed by the opposite sex. Marty Hazelton at the University of California, Los Angeles, proposed a theory called error management theory to explain this. Marty found and demonstrated in a number of studies that men tend to over-perceive interest in women. She called this the sexual over-perception bias. Men tend to over-interpret female signals as encouraging. The reason for that, according to Marty, is that for men, the cost of incorrectly ignoring a potentially positive sign from a woman is more costly than misinterpreting a positive signal as encouraging. So men suffer from this sexual over-perception bias. Women, on the other hand, suffer from what Marty called a commitment under-perception bias. Women tend to be more skeptical and more critical and more likely to reject signs of male commitment and interest. And the reason for that, again, according to Marty, is that for women the costly mistake is incorrectly assume reliability and commitment by a potential male partner when there isn't one. Hazelton argues that, interestingly, these deep-seated attributional biases in men and women are likely to have an evolutionary origin. They have to do with the fact that men and women face different reproductive costs. We already looked at parental investment theory in an earlier lecture. This theory is a good explanation why even in cognitive processes, judgments, attributions, men and women seem to engage in different motivated thinking. In addition to distorting our attributions of the social world in favor of individual objectives, it turns out that human beings also regularly engage in group-serving attributional bias, attempts to construct the world in such a way that their own group, the in-group, comes out looking better. Pettigrew called this the ultimate attribution error. A good example of the ultimate attribution error is that when you perceive some negative behavior in an outgroup or an outgroup member, there is a tendency to attribute that to dispositions, the internal personality and characteristics of that group, and positive behaviors we tend to attribute to temporary external forces. In other words, we devalue outgroups by giving internal attributions for undesirable behaviors and external attributions for desirable behaviors. We do exactly the opposite for the in-group. We tend to claim credit for any positive behavior performed by our own group and tend to see negative behaviors as only due to some external or temporary force. This attributional tendency naturally gives rise to negative generalizations about outgroups, often based on a few individual members. Ellison and Messick also argued that there is a kind of a reverse process when a group makes some kind of a decision that you disapprove. There's a tendency to blame this on every individual member and hold them personally responsible for the decision. This often gives rise to political polarization and tribalism, the tendency to see outgroup members as all the same, all homogeneous, and more likely to have negative characteristics. We can look at this group-serving attributional bias as yet another example of the kind of tribal cognition that we have discussed previously. There's a lot of evidence that human beings are naturally inclined to perceive the world in ways which gives preference to their in-group and devalues out-groups. The minimal group experiments by Henri Tajfel showed this. Research on groupthink and the tendency to be subject to consensual delusions is another example. And as we have seen in the previous lecture, stereotyping, illusory correlation, all fuel this tendency to see our own group as better and preferable to outgroups. This, of course, can result in many everyday examples of intergroup conflict and discrimination. Nationalism, supporting a particular sports teams, identity politics when you believe that the identity group to which you belong is particularly important and superior to other identity groups. These are all processes that can easily produce tribalism and intergroup hatred. Click on the link at the bottom of the slide and view this short video on the science of tribalism. The group-oriented attributional bias that we are discussing essentially have a self-enhancing function. People seem to derive some sense of positive identity by thinking more positively about their in-groups and negatively about the out-groups. We simply feel better about ourselves when we can generate more favorable explanations for our in-group behaviors. Now, this tendency does promote polarization and conflict between groups, which can be very dangerous. One way of managing this very powerful evolutionary tendency for groupishness is to try to generate groups which are larger, more inclusive, and less likely to divide us into special identity categories. One possible reason for the growth of group conflict in recent years has been the formation of internet bubbles. If you're only going to hear news or information from people who already think like you, this is likely to promote the tendency to see the world in a particular way and become less sensitive to understanding that other people might legitimately have different perceptions. And this could be one of the reasons why intolerance appears to be growing. Please look at the two links at the bottom of this slide again, looking at group-serving attributions and also an excellent lecture on the evolution of different kinds of identity groups throughout human history. Interestingly, there is also a spontaneous automatic bias in the way people use language to describe in-group and out-group positive and negative behaviors. Fiedler and Shemin proposed a theory called the theory of linguistic intergroup bias, which predicted that when we describe positive behaviors by an in-group member, we tend to use general abstract terms, and when we describe positive behaviors by an out-group member, we tend to use very specific, concrete, and behavioral terms. In other words, it seems like we signal that good things in our group are general and universal, good things in an out-group are isolated and special. And the opposite happens when explaining bad behaviors, negative actions. The in-group tends to be described in a highly specific and circumscribed way, and the out-group tends to be described in a general way, as if bad behavior would be generally typical of those members. This habitual language inclination in itself contributes to perpetuating negative attitudes towards the in-group and promoting positive attitudes towards the out-group. So to sum up, in this lecture, we discussed attribution theory, the study of how human beings go about inferring causality and making sense of the social world. We have seen that attribution theories initially sought to create a model that provides a scientific explanation of how the inference of causes proceeds, and basically the aim of the human judge is to make distinctions between internal and external causation. And this is important because only by assuming internal causation can we predict the behavior of other people with any certainty. We have also seen that these attributional strategies are only partly rational. They are subject to a large number of biases and distortions, which can be either cognitive or motivational in character. So it seems like in making sense of the world, we are only partly motivated by seeking understanding. We are also motivated to enhance and defend our self-esteem and to promote group identity. In the next lecture, we're going to move on to look at attributions about ourselves, self-attribution.